we found just a couple of weeks ago is that the BC Centre for Disease Control had done a survey to 5,000 BC doctors in the fall of 2008, and it was to find out their understanding of Lyme disease. And we got back really startling results a couple of weeks ago. And the BC CDC has reported annual cases of Lyme disease in the province of BC as being between 2 cases a year, sometimes up to 13 as a high. And what this information that we got through a Freedom of Information request showed is in 2007, there were 221 cases of Lyme disease diagnosed in BC that year. And that is 30 times the rate of Lyme disease that was diagnosed in 2006. And for the life of me, as someone with Lyme disease, I cannot understand why the BC Centre for Disease Control did not release that information publicly. If, when there's bear attacks in the province of BC, people are warned about those bear attacks. And so let's say there were 3 or 4 bear attacks last year in BC. Let's say that number went up to 200. People would take precautions. You'd be careful about where you went because you wouldn't want to risk being attacked by a bear. And the same thing applies with Lyme disease. Why didn't the BC CDC, who's in charge of public health in this province, why didn't they inform the public about an increase in Lyme disease that was 30 times?
So did they misrepresent the numbers, or they just omitted to tell us the numbers?
I think they misrepresented the numbers. That you look at, they release Lyme disease numbers every year, and it's in a survey called, or a report called the Annual Summary of Reportable Diseases in BC. And they showed that in 2007, there were supposedly just 13 cases of Lyme disease, when of course the survey showed 221 cases of Lyme disease being diagnosed in BC. And then in 2008, the BC Centre for Disease Control showed that there were just 6 cases of Lyme disease reported in BC. And then in 2009, it was just 10 cases. Now that's a massive discrepancy between the numbers. And we need to know those 221 cases. We need to know where those cases occurred in British Columbia. The BC CDC needs to map that information and release it publicly. We also need to know, did the BC Centre for Disease Control brief the health minister? And if they did, why didn't the health minister come out with this information publicly? Or if they didn't, why didn't they brief the minister?
So could it be, as Kurt suggested, that potentially it's the way Lyme disease is reported, lab results versus... anecdotal? Or... Well,
one of the things that we do know is that the blood tests for Lyme disease, that there's lots of concerns about their accuracy. And because of that the BC CDC recognizes that Lyme disease is supposed to be a clinical diagnosis by a doctor. And blood tests can help back that up. And so they've been reporting for the last 10 years both clinical diagnoses by doctors as well as laboratory results. But in this case, with their own survey going out to 5,000 BC doctors showing 221 cases in 2007, they didn't report that publicly. And you have to ask why. And the other thing that's a concern, just 1/3 of the doctors responded, which isn't a bad response rate to a survey. But let's extrapolate those 221 cases times 3. That's over 660 cases of Lyme disease that likely happened in British Columbia in 2007.
And why should we as the public be concerned about the fact there are more than 600? That sounds like a low number. There are millions of us here. 600?
Well, it's a growing disease. It's a very serious disease if you're bitten by a tick infected with Lyme disease. That in serious cases it can cause paralysis. It has been known to cause death. That the public, just like if there were 600 bear attacks in BC, you'd say, wow, I want to be informed about that. I want to know where those bear attacks happened. As a person who's in the forest, as people, in Stanley Park, let's say there were, 25 cases that were diagnosed in Vancouver. Let's say there are another 25 cases that were diagnosed in Prince George. People have a right to know that so they can protect themselves when they're going out in the forest, so they can be aware that if they got bitten by a tick and they developed a bullseye rash, that they would know to go to a doctor. That information is power, and the BC Centre for Disease Control withheld that information, and their mandate is to protect public health. Why on earth wouldn't they release this information about a dramatic increase in incidence of Lyme disease in BC? Why wouldn't they release that information to the public?
What's the answer?
I don't know. For the life of me, I don't know if I'm thinking it's because the BC Centre for Disease Control has said publicly and repeatedly for the last 10, 20 years that Lyme disease is extremely rare in British Columbia. And then they have information from their own survey that completely contradicts those numbers. But I don't even care in some ways about why they did or didn't. They should have done the right thing. They have a mandate to protect the public health. And they suppressed information instead of releasing information that about an emerging serious infectious illness, Lyme disease. And also there's been a huge public debate about the incidence of Lyme disease in British Columbia. And people with Lyme disease, such as myself, have been engaged in this debate, and we're saying, look, we think Lyme disease is underdiagnosed, probably radically underdiagnosed in British Columbia.
How many people do you think have Lyme disease in BC?
I don't know. I know that there's a Lower Mainland Lyme disease support group, and I've met dozens and dozens and dozens of people, scores of people. I know I've had two friends, one who was a vet and was doing wildlife surveys that was diagnosed with Lyme disease, someone else who contracted it in Ontario in a provincial park in southern Ontario, which is also endemic for Lyme disease.
Is there a cure?
If it's caught early and treated aggressively with antibiotics, you can usually be cured. When it becomes late stage, or if you haven't been diagnosed, I wasn't diagnosed for over 15 years, it becomes disseminated through your body, and it becomes very, very, very difficult to treat, and you get continuing and more serious health problems.
If they're underreporting this, or actually misreporting reporting this, could they be doing this with other diseases? Is that a concern?
I think that is a concern, and I think what you need is an impartial investigation about what the BC Centre for Disease Control did on this information about a dramatic increase in the incidence of Lyme disease in BC. I know that the Lyme disease community in British Columbia has lost faith in the BC CDC on this file.
But they should do that because this could have a ripple effect on other diseases?
Well, I think one of the things you have to know as a citizen of this province that's relying on the BC CDC to provide professional, medical, scientific information to the public is that you trust them to do this. And yet here they had a survey that they did in 2008 that shows Lyme disease was being diagnosed in this province at a rate that was 30 times greater than 2006. And what did they do with that information? They sat on it, and they didn't release it to the public. And the only way we got it is when we did a Freedom of Information request, and they reluctantly coughed up the information to us. I don't think they've done an in-depth survey of this kind in the past. And I don't think they attempted to talk to the 5,000 GPs and specialists in BC and find out, do they understand Lyme disease? Are they able to treat it? Are they able to diagnose it? But it obviously does call into question that if in 1 year you have 221 cases, and that was 2007, that had been diagnosed by doctors, but the previous year, the BC Centre for Disease Control said there were just 7 cases. Obviously, I'd say there were doctors that were diagnosing and treating Lyme disease in 2006 and 2005, and those numbers weren't forthcoming. And
well, the doctors, though, don't seem to have reported them directly to CDC as a matter of course in 2007.
That appears to be the case. Lyme disease has been a reportable illness in British Columbia since 1994. But the BC Centre for Disease Control survey showed that 40% of doctors were unaware that it was a reportable illness. And what was also surprising was 63% of doctors that were surveyed didn't understand that a bullseye rash, and it's a very distinctive rash that you can get with Lyme disease when you're bitten by an infected tick. 63% of doctors didn't understand that this distinctive bullseye rash is diagnostic of Lyme disease. So it shows that there's some education that needs to be done amongst doctors in British Columbia, and we would expect the BC Centre for Disease Control to lead the way and not be withholding or sitting on information that is directly relevant to public health issues. BC CDC has a responsibility as sort of an organization that oversees doctors to a certain extent, especially about infectious diseases, to report on that. And so I scratched my head when I got this information, and I was trying to think, why would the BC Centre for Disease Control, and again, it's not the whole BC Centre for Disease Control. There's a couple of people within that centre who are responsible for the Lyme disease file. But I did ask that question, why would they withhold this very important information from the public? And I don't know if they were trying to protect doctors. I don't know if they were trying to protect their own professional reputations. But there's some very hard questions that need to be asked, and public health issues are at stake.